All right, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I hope you enjoy our new moodier lighting that we have here. Good afternoon as well to our online viewership. My name is Stan Veuger. I'm a senior fellow here at AEI. I'm delighted to host today's event on the macroeconomic consequences of the second Trump administration's changes to immigration policy. The administration has implemented a number of dramatic changes to U.S. immigration policy, many of them quite controversial, some of them tied up in litigation. It's reportedly considering a number of additional measures. These measures will have significant consequences for millions of immigrants and potential immigrants, their families, employers, customers, other associates, and for the economy in general. We're going to discuss these consequences today with our two esteemed guests, Wendy Edelberg and Pia Orrenius. Wendy is a senior fellow in economic studies at Brookings. Pia is an adjunct scholar here at AEI, as well as vice president and senior economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. The run of show today is straightforward. We'll give brief opening presentations. I will talk about sort of objectives of the Trump administration immigration policy and measures that have been taken so far and that will potentially be taken. Then Pia will speak on enforcement efforts so far, and Wendy will talk about the macroeconomic consequences in particular. We'll do that, and then we'll talk amongst ourselves for a bit, and then we'll have audience Q&A. If you're an online viewer and you'd like to submit a question, you can send those to tonga.aukovi@aei.org or via Twitter with hashtag AskAIEcon. Anyway, I'm going to go present first. So I'm going to transition now from my role as moderator into my role as presenter about the administration's objectives and immigration actions so far. As most of you will know, U.S. population grew by a lot more in the period 2021-2024 than the CBO baseline would have suggested, maybe 5 to 6 million people more than that baseline, thanks to net immigration. A lot of that was driven by illegal crossings, people who were paroled into the country under various programs, asylum seekers, and then many of the relatively recent arrivals became beneficiaries of temporary protected status. The border surge has declined dramatically, really since last summer, and we'll see that in more detail. The Trump administration, when it came in, I think it's pretty straightforward to summarize the goals of their immigration policy. They want to reduce inflows and increase outflows. Now, that sounds very simplistic, but I think that really is the way to think about it. The first bullet point, reducing inflows, does not, I think, quite get as much attention as increasing outflows. As we'll see, a lot of the inflows that they've managed to reduce are legal or close to legal inflows. On the outflow side, I don't think they've accomplished as much yet as they would like, as they set out to. I think it's also good to put it in this simplistic manner because certainly on the outflow side, the administration is focused on all sorts of categories of immigrants. One thing I'll highlight is that the efforts are not focused on deporting violent criminals per se. It's really a much broader push to reduce the immigrant population in the U.S. So with that, let's look at some of the initiatives we've seen so far. First, actions meant to decrease inflows. So the administration has suspended the refugee resettlement program, I guess except for Afrikaner farmers. That's a sizable program. About 100,000 people came in during fiscal year 2024. It's ended the humanitarian parole program for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans, CHMV. That program, through that program, about 330,000 people arrived in fiscal 2024. It also ended Uniting for Ukraine and the Afghan parole program, through which another 75,000 people arrived in 2024. So if you just look at those first three bullet points, that's about 500,000 people who arrived through those programs in fiscal 2024 who are basically just not coming, right? And so if you think about that over a 4-year period, we're talking about millions of people who were arriving legally who are not going to arrive. Then, in addition, on the inflow side, the administration has deployed the military to the border. It's further narrowed asylum at the border after the Biden administration made significant moves there last summer, and it's engaged in various deterrence actions. There obviously it's a little unclear what is meant to deter and what is meant to get people to leave the interior. In any case, the results so far, I would say, have been a large drop in inflows, a relatively low number of border encounters now, but also, and maybe that's related to the deterrence actions, a pretty steep drop in tourism, it looks like. All right, so that's actions meant to decrease inflows, where I think, the administration, even if you disagree with its objectives, has I think been relatively effective. Part of that is continuation of trends that existed. Part of that is just that legal inflows are really easy to control for the U.S. federal government, right? Because of course, the U.S. determines which people can come here legally, and so that's really, I think, the place where the federal government has the most direct control over immigration flows, right? If you say you stop issuing F1 visas, for sure you'll have many fewer immigrants arrive to study here. You end the CHMV program, people cannot come in through the CHMV program. And so I think that's important to keep in mind, especially because the numbers here are quite large. Much larger, for example, than to look forward to outflows. We've been fighting over a few hundred people who've been deported to El Salvador now for weeks on end, right? They've drawn much more attention than these hundreds of thousands of people, of potential immigrants who are not coming. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. All right, so then let's turn to outflows. So here, a lot of what the administration has done is sort of to make life more complicated for immigrants without a permanent status or who are not lawfully present in various ways, often short of actually deporting them. So to take again a number of programs, 350,000 Venezuelans have lost their temporary protected status, I guess, as of the Supreme Court's decision yesterday. Legal proceedings will continue, but those people literally went from having legal status and work authorization to being not lawfully present unless they could come up with a different route to status. There are 500,000 people who were paroled in through the CHMV program that I mentioned who the administration has been trying to strip of their status. That is currently tied up in court. Then there is a number of other recipients of temporary protected status whose status will be terminated in the coming months. In particular, a large group of Haitian TPS beneficiaries. So again, these are very large numbers. Of course, these people, even if they lose their status, do not automatically depart the country. That may be the administration's objective, but many of them will either remain in the country illegally or they will try to apply for status through other routes, which some of them have. And so it's not clear, to what extent these numbers are going to translate into people actually leaving the country. The administration has done a number of other things. I'd say not everyone likes this framing, but they've deprioritized, I think, the arrest and deportation of violent criminals. By deprioritized, I mean they are now focused on arresting and deporting a much broader group of people who are illegally present than the Biden administration was. And so you see that in news reports constantly, I think. They've lifted restrictions on ICE arrests in sensitive locations like churches, schools, et cetera. They canceled and then uncanceled thousands of student visas of people who had committed often minor traffic infractions and the like. They've detained a number of visa holders and permanent residents who had criticized the Israeli government. They've expanded expedited removal, so the way to transport people back out of the country quickly if they are relatively recent arrivals. They've established an illegal immigrant registry. They've kidnapped, I think is a fair term, hundreds of Venezuelans, sent them to El Salvador without due process. And as a result, arrests are up. Not clear that deportations overall have increased much, but there's definitely more people have been detained, as we'll see in some of the numbers you're going to show. But I think if you just think of, what is the stock of immigrants in the country, the reductions in inflows so far has been much more important than an increase in outflows, right? Just if you think about the absolute number of people present. Now, what else may the administration do? There was at some point talk about invoking Title 42 again, the public health measure at the border. Given how the border situation has evolved, I don't know that that's very likely anymore. There has been discussion of a new and expanded Muslim or travel ban. An order has circulated with many more countries on it than during the first Trump administration. That has not been issued yet. I think it's quite possible the administration will just make it harder to get visas issued in all kinds of places. Of course, significant cuts at USCIS and at the State Department would be a part of that effort. And we've seen some of those cuts announced. Those are particularly, the motivation for them is particularly clear, I think, at USCIS. It's all funded based on fee revenue. And so cutting there doesn't actually save taxpayers money. It just makes it harder to get your visa applications processed. And finally, there's been talk of banning students, or maybe even all immigrants, from countries that are not willing to cooperate with deportation efforts, which would include a number of large countries and would be, I think, of particular importance to institutions of higher education that rely heavily on Chinese students. Then finally, there's a number of potential actions meant to increase outflows, some of which I think will definitely come. So we have seen that the administration continues to cancel or not extend TPS for people from different countries. There's a chance they will try to cancel DACA, the status that Dreamers have. The construction of the illegal immigrant registry may lead to criminalization of mere presence, which is currently not a federal offense. And then I think maybe the biggest factors that are so outside what immigration policy has looked like in recent years that are under consideration are all the additional spending in the reconciliation bill. So there is an immense amount of additional spending on various anti-immigration measures there, mostly focused on detention, but some of it also on ICE staffing. ICE's budget would become by far the largest budget of any law enforcement agency in the federal government, and of course it wouldn't happen within a week, but it would lead to the construction of a much more significant deportation apparatus. There's in the reconciliation bill, there's a number of other anti-immigrant measures that you could think of as, maybe trying to make it less attractive for people to stay here, especially people without legal status. So, for example, there's a new tax on remittances in the House bill. There are changes to the child tax credit that would make the parents of U.S. citizen children who do not themselves have legal status become ineligible for the child tax credit. And there are some changes to healthcare premium tax credits as well that would disproportionately affect families that include immigrants with various statuses. I'm going to leave it at that. That's my overview of what's been going on. So as I said, big reduction in inflows, outflows I think yet to be seen. I will turn it now to Pia, who will talk more about the enforcement side of things. Yeah.
Thank you, Stan. Thanks for having me. Hello, everyone. So I'll go through some of the similar themes to what Stan has been discussing, and then show you some data, and then hopefully transition to Wendy's part. So really, as an overview, we saw an immigration surge in the post-pandemic that we've never seen anything like it before. And so welcoming policies under the Biden administration played a big role, I think. But now, of course, fast forward, to the Trump administration, migrant encounters are now down 95%. So basically, the border's basically closed, at least as far as it concerns unauthorized immigration or asylum seekers. The interesting thing about these surge migrants that came in this post-pandemic period, they were unlike other previous waves of border migrants in that they were essentially allowed in, so they were legal. So they got work permits, for example. Not legal, that's why it's in quotes, quasi-legal. So under the strange, terminology in the immigration law. So quasi-legal, we can say. And they were from new origins in many cases. Venezuela, I think, is the best example of that. And because in the case of Venezuelans and others from, kind of new countries of origin, really an unusually high share lacked networks. And I think that we saw that some of those pressures as migrants were bused to new destinations where they didn't have, family and friends and so forth, there was a lot of friction trying to get those migrants settled, and certainly a lot of costs involved, for those cities that were, receiving these unusually high share of or high number of immigrants. The crackdown on surge migration really began late in the Biden administration. It began in late 2023, I think first with help from Mexico, and I think I try to always remind people of that because I think they played an instrumental part. By the time Biden actually implemented his asylum ban in June 24, then migration at the border was already way down. But then, of course, enforcement really intensified under the Trump administration, as Stan has discussed. So that famous CBP-1 app that initially didn't work at all, that allowed people at the border to seek asylum through this app and get appointments. When it finally was working, it did let in a lot of people. And then, of course, that was the first thing that was canceled on day one of the Trump administration, and then remain in Mexico for the asylum seekers that did, still want to file claims. That program was reinstated. So now if you ask for asylum at the U.S. border, you will have to wait in Mexico for an appointment. Various humanitarian parole and TPS programs were reversed, as Stan was discussing. And when Trump took office, plans for increased deportations, really the initial goal was for ICE to arrest about 1,500 people a day. If all those people are deported or removed, if you will, then that would be about 500,000 removals in a year. And so, short of the 1 million, which was another target that was thrown around, but that was certainly where they hoped to start. They're not there yet. So this is kind of what the border surge looks like. In blue, you can see the southwest border encounters. So that's the number of migrants that the Border Patrol was encountering on the southwest border. And the red line is interesting because really the DHS started releasing these data under the Biden administration, really thanks to Mark Rosenblum at DHS. They have a statistics office, and they started releasing the red line, which is how many people were let in. So you can actually see how many people did they encounter and how many people were let in. And by 2023, 2024, they're almost at the same level. So basically, if you just showed up on the border, you were let in. So that was really obviously why we're experiencing such a backlash now. But fast forward to the end of that line, and you can see that encounters are way, way down. That blue line is really fast approaching zero, basically. So we're down again 95% year on year. We had a lot of policies in place. Some of them were intended to, deter migration and did not, or initially did and then didn't. And then, so it was, at the end of the day, the Title 42 is that kind of that green square there. Title 42, even as it was initially implemented, yes, there was very little migration, but then of course, both those lines go up during Title 42. So that was not a magic bullet. By the end of Title 42, a lot of people were coming into the country. CBP-1 app, initially, there were declines in immigration. Once it was launched, it was meant to kind of control the flow, but then of course, we reached new highs with the CBP-1 app in place. And then the blue line is kind of when Biden put in his asylum caps, and you can see that by then, already migration at the border was way, way down. And that, again, just to give a shout out to the Mexicans for really doing, helping out. As many of the migrants were transitioning through Mexico, they were actually stopped. As Stan was saying, what happened with all this temporary status granted to the migrants that were coming in, this kind of quasi-legal population, as far as we can figure out, has risen to about 7 million immigrants in the U.S. They, whether it's asylum seekers, these humanitarian parole people, the TPS holders, DACA, and so forth, you can see that, this is kind of the migration in peril of the type of policies that are being implemented right now. So Plus, not included here, although there is some double counting, is kind of the 11 million unauthorized immigrants that don't even have the quasi-legal status. Interesting, here you can just see how people got work permits. I just think it's fascinating. And it speaks to what Wendy's going to talk about, because these surge migrants really showed up in the employment numbers, the official employment numbers from BLS. And that's because, just look at 2024, for instance, 2 million work permits issued to this category of migrants. Really, really incredible feat. If we ever need these workers again in the future, this is how you do it, apparently. The origins changed. Here you can see kind of the first bar is the pre-pandemic origins of the surge migrants, and the second bar is the post-pandemic origins of the surge migrants. And really the decrease in the orange portion is the declining share of Central Americans. And then the purple portion is really the increase in South American migration, and that's mostly Venezuelan. So that's really kind of the transformation that we saw in the origins of the migrants that were coming post-pandemic. Where did they go? Well, they kind of went to where they usually go. I mean, here we can see the #1 states really were California, Texas, Florida, and New York. So those are the dark blue. And then the orange are kind of the next tier of recipient states that included, like, Illinois, for example. So not surprising, perhaps, that they went where they typically go, although it was interesting, again, because like when the Venezuelans were bused to New York and bused to Illinois, they didn't have a network, as I mentioned previously. And that's why we heard all those news stories about, wow, there's nowhere to house them, and there's no money to give them, and they need a lot of services. So if you talk to nonprofits in Chicago, they'll tell you they had no problem settling 30,000 Ukrainians. The Ukrainians came in, 30,000 within 6 months, and they disappeared. Nobody could even see, because they had networks. But then the Venezuelans came and they had nowhere to go, and so that's kind of where you notice it more. So what happened to enforcement during this period of time? Well, there is no more data on removals, probably because the migrant removals are probably pretty low right now. Maybe that's why they're not publishing the data. But this is the data through fiscal year 2024. And so you can see even in 2024 and during the post-pandemic period when we had record migration, those individuals are not really being removed. So really the record high on migrant removal still belongs to President Obama in 2013. It's hard to do removals. So here is removals. You can see most removals actually happen at the border. That's the blue line here. And very few removals happen in the interior. That's the orange line here. So why are there so few removals in the interior? That's because what Stan was saying, it's actually super, super hard to find people that are deportable in a timely way with a limited number of resources. So, it's 5,000, 6,000 in a month. So, it's a low number because it's difficult to do. But I will say that, again, they're not publishing any removal data right now, but they are publishing ICE arrests. So here's really the only enforcement data that we can get at this point. So here you can see that ICE arrests actually spiked in February and March of 2025. So really at this level of arrests, if we assume that all these people who are arrested are deported, that would give you about 250,000 removals in a year. That's still far from the initial goal, which was 500,000, and the ambitious goal, which is 1 million in a year. So we're still falling short here. But again, it's hard. So what are they trying to do in order to amplify their efforts? This is what Stan was talking about. They're trying to make it easier to arrest people. They're stripping them of their TPS status and their parole status, so then there's more undocumented. They're trying to pull resources from other agencies like police and so forth. They're allowing arrests in schools, churches, and immigration courtrooms. They're increasing detention space by using military bases, state jails and prisons in other countries, as you've heard. There will be a lot more funding coming, obviously, and that's going to speed up those efforts. But nonetheless, there's still this thing that most people in the US, they have a right to a court hearing before they're deported. So unless they can, subject them to expedited removal, which is only a small share of them, they're really stuck with, if they follow the law in, letting people have a court hearing. So they're encouraging self-deportation. So I think they're giving you, they'll buy your plane ticket home if you promise to leave. So really, so let's just summarize so we can get to Wendy. So unauthorized migration is obviously down very sharply. The biggest reason is a decline in inflows. The biggest reason is not increasing outflows. Outflows are still very, very limited because deportations, removals from the interior are really hard to do, and it's going to take a lot of time and resources. The outlook really is that the pace of arrests and removals are going to increase, but they're probably not going to reach targets, those ambitious targets that have been set. And so we are going to experience probably a larger, more entrenched and shadowy undocumented population that's probably also very fearful. And so that's going to also have repercussions for the economic effects. The negative economic impact really is more related to inflows than deportations, since inflows are already down so much. So my argument would be that it's probably already being realized. And then we probably will have additional impacts from these chilling effects as people are less likely to leave their homes to go to work or to go to school. Thank you.
All right. With that excellent discussion of where we are, I'm going to talk about what I think this is doing to the macroeconomy. All right, so I'm going to spend a minute talking about how the immigration surge, I think, affected the macroeconomy in recent years, to give you a sense of the up, and then how declining net migration, I think, will affect the macroeconomy going forward. All right, so the immigration surge, this is the most important economic indicator that you should keep in mind when you think about how important the surge was for the economy. The immigration surge roughly doubled the pace that employment could rise without sparking inflation. So consider that employment obviously sank like a stone in 2020 with the closing of the economy. And then in 2021, through the second half of 2020 and 2021, it was rebounding, and that was a big reason for the very big numbers that we were seeing in the monthly employment reports. But then the numbers kept being big in a way that surprised me because, first of all, the unemployment rate wasn't moving very much. And second, while we did have wage inflation, and people like me were very laser focused on how strong wage inflation was, it actually wasn't that big and certainly wasn't big enough for me to understand any economic effect of the very large payroll employment numbers that we were seeing. And what squares that circle is that this surge in immigration was leading to much higher employment growth that the economy could sustain without sparking inflation. So before the pandemic, lots of agencies, the Congressional Budget Office, the Social Security Administration, was writing down what they thought sustainable employment growth was in 22, 23, 24. And this is basically just looking at demographics and thinking about what's happening to the growth in the adult population in the United States and what we think the propensity of people to participate in the labor force is. And what you were seeing, this is before the pandemic, is that this so-called break-even employment growth was about 60,000 to 140,000 in 2022. Then actually the range falls a little bit in 23 and then falls again in 24. And the reason that it's falling over time is that we are right now in the grip of dramatic changes in what's happening to demographics in the United States, the aging of the population, and some echo effects of lower fertility rates, along with changes in labor force participation. Okay, so now with the immigration surge in hand and thinking really hard about what that immigration surge means for labor force growth, This is now what Tara Watson and I, a co-author of mine and Stan's, estimate the break-even pace of employment growth was in 22, 23, 24. And you can see it's almost double. So in 2024, without the immigration surge, I would have said the economy at a sustainable pace could increase employment on a monthly basis by about 60 to 100,000, which would mean, opening up the newspaper and seeing that the monthly payroll growth was 75,000 and saying that's a great number. And instead, because of the immigration surge, you would expect to open up the newspaper, and if we saw a good number, it would be somewhere between 160,000 and 200,000. So complete game changer. Now, the effects on the economy, on GDP and consumer spending, were also positive, but far less notable, because for two reasons. One, we already have a big, labor supply, and so this is having a big marginal effect on how fast the labor force is growing, but not as much of an effect on how much faster GDP is growing. But also because immigrants, the typical immigrant earns a lower wage, which is to say they are less productive than the typical native-born worker. And that is particularly true for people who are just in the country and in the labor force recently. So the effects on the economy were also positive, but less game-changingly so. All right, so now let's look at where we are in, we think where we might be in 2025. So declining net migration will reduce economic growth going forward. So in work with Stan and again with Tara, we thought about a range of possible net migration paths in 25, 26, 27, and 28. We thought about a low range for immigration under a second Trump administration and a high range. The high range was mostly calibrated to immigration policy in the first Trump administration. And the red dots were more thinking about what Trump was saying that he were his aspirations, as in our minds constrained by logistics and legal constraints and the like. We are much closer, we think, to the red dots than the low dots, than the high dots. But we have some ongoing work to think about really how we would update these numbers. But I mostly want you to think about where those low dots are, which is to say, I think what we're on track for, particularly given the deportations that Pia ended with in the several 100,000 over the course of the year, we are on track for negative net migration in 2025, which would be an extraordinary fact. And what it would also mean is very weak population growth overall. So the bottom panel, net migration and natural increases, shows you what total population looks like, adult population 16 and over, given these immigration projections. And you can see we are almost at zero population growth in 2025 if our 2025 immigration number in that low dot actually comes to pass. All right, so what does that mean for the economy overall? We thought about 3 different channels through which negative net migration would affect the economy. One is simply the direct effect on GDP growth. You have fewer immigrants in the country making things, either because people have left or people who would otherwise come are not coming. And given the numbers that I just showed you on the previous slide, this is now, I'm only focused on the low scenarios. That would reduce GDP growth in 25 relative to 24 by 0.2 percentage points. Another effect is that because you have fewer people in the country making income, they are spending less money. And normally, when things kind of settle down and the economy kind of chugs along in a sustainable, predictable way, this is not its own extra effect. As I'll show you in the next slide, I think, if you think about how negative net migration really would affect the economy over the long term, when these are completely expected trends over time, the economy is just smaller. Fewer people are making things and fewer people are consuming things, and generally that just kind of works itself out. But because this is to some degree going to come as a surprise to businesses in 2025, we believe that this will have its own economic effect. If you're a restaurant operating in an area that is pretty densely populated with immigrants, you may have thought in 2024 that your restaurant was really popular and doing really well, and this was actually a fine time to expand. And so you are now expanding, and you find yourself in 2025 with a lot fewer customers, and you are now kind of sad to be saddled with an extra pizza oven and a couple of extra workers that you no longer need, and you're going to try to unload that pizza oven and lay off those workers. And that in and of itself is going to reduce economic growth. So that's the additional effect owing to a reduction in consumer spending. And then finally, I think that immigrants who stay in the country in 2025 will reduce their own consumer spending. They will increase their rates of saving because they are unsure about what their economic circumstances are, because they are imagining that they may leave the United States in coming years, and in the meantime, they're going to raise their saving. And that is going to have a similar economic effect to the one that I just described, where restaurant owners are going to be sad that they have pizza ovens and workers that they don't want. And the total effect accumulates to 0.4 percentage point on GDP growth. I'm pretty uncertain about the exact numbers that I have just described, but I am relatively certain that these are important channels to consider, and I'm also relatively certain that I'm in the right order of magnitude. And so this is certainly a negative effect on near-term economic growth, but I don't think that it is going to make the economy unrecognizable in 2025. I think that to the degree that we feel as a country the startling effects of the immigration policy that the Trump administration is putting in place, it's more through the images and how we feel about it, and less about the economic effects that will be consequences as a result. And then very quickly, I just want to give a shout out to the fact that more immigration just over time, just to make an obvious point, means a larger economy. And so if you think about what the economy might look like in 2034 under two immigration scenarios here, I'm going back to these scenarios, the low dots and the high dots, and if we just kind of extend them through 2034, imagining a world where immigration kind of goes back to pre-Trump trends, the difference between those two scenarios is either a labor force that's contributing 1% to GDP growth, to the level of GDP, versus 1.5%. So a difference of 0.5 percentage point. And if we have a bigger labor force, we're going to want more capital, so that has its own effect on GDP. So the way to think about this is that very weak immigration over the next 10 years versus immigration over the next 10 years that's more like what we've seen in history is the difference between an economy that is, 0.75 percentage point smaller. Again, notable, if we want our economy to be bigger, immigration is an obvious avenue to tap to try to make our economy bigger, but not an economy that is unrecognizable. I'll just say quickly, a lot of people in my position, and I think perhaps some people in the room and my co-authors have said, the United States needs immigration to have economic growth or to have a robust economy. I don't think that that's right. I think that We can be a smaller economy. I think Japan is a perfectly, stable economy. It's just a very, very different economy, and it would feel different. So I think that the difference between immigration contributing 1.4% and immigration contributing 2.1% kind of belies that underneath that, the economy with a lot less immigration is going to have a lot more automation. It's going to have some areas contracting and some it's going to have a significant difference in relative prices. But nonetheless, the economy will grow. Okay?
Thank you, Wendy.
Do I do anything to this?
No, you can give it to me.
I'll give it to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask a couple questions, then we can take some questions from the audience. Pia, I was curious, do you have any thoughts on why the various measures that were taken in 2020, 2021, like Title 42, why they did not restrict inflows at the border, at least not for more than a minimum amount of time, whereas the current measures, and really the measures since last summer, have reduced inflows by so much? And do you think that that current reduction is sustainable in the sense that we're going to continue to see these low numbers of border encounters for the next 3 years, or do you think there'll be a rebound?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Title 42, when it was enforced, I think it was, it was initially successful. I guess I would say two things. Part of the reason that Title 42 lost its edge was that they started carving out exemptions. So first exemptions for minors, and then, other exemptions, for families. And with every exemption, just, and people dispute this, but now we actually have a paper that's coming out on this, my co-author and I, and where we show exactly how when you carve out these exemptions, more people actually come. So if you're, so in November, I think 2020, they carved out an exemption for Central American minors. Well, to protect minors, obviously, and let them in and reunite them with family and so forth. But of course, what happens in that case is more minors come, and it's a very dangerous trip. So you're actually really not, you're trying to help, and it's not clear that you're helping because you're actually creating a bigger flow and more, kids in danger. So anyway, so a lot of exemptions really kind of led to the end of Title 42 as an effective strategy. But I think, if you have, and of course, the other thing about Title 42 was that, people, they very quickly deported people under Title 42. And normally, when people are caught on the border, they're actually subjected to prosecution. And so they're actually are arrested, and then they go to court, and then they usually get, a sentence, and then they spend maybe a week in jail or something, and then they go home. But that's actually a big deterrent. Nobody wants to be arrested and jailed or go to court, and so, or have a record. So the fact in Title 42 that they just became kind of like a revolving door, that was another problem, because you have to have those deterrence measures. I mean, just catching somebody, putting them back on the other side of the border so they can try again is not effective. And so, but I think, what we know with the Trump administration, we know what works. We know if we're tough on the border, and we, obviously we have a lot of personnel on the border and we can do the job. If there's not a lot of holes in the process, then I think absolutely we can enforce the border. My hope is, Stan, that this means people will realize we can enforce the border, we can stop the unauthorized immigration, and maybe that'll let people, trust the system enough to go on and do some kind of comprehensive immigration reform. That's my dream, but who knows?
Well, we'll see. Thank you. Wendy, two things that people may say sort of in response to these relatively small estimates that, that we have come up with, that you have come up with. The one thing is, you're ignoring effects on innovation and complementarities between different kind of workers, et cetera. Another response may be, look, GDP is not a welfare measure, and what you're completely missing here is the sort of large negative impact that these measures have on, say, households from which one member is removed, or how would you respond to those two lines of commentary?
So I would respond differently. So on the first thing, It is absolutely right. I have ignored, these estimates ignore what would no doubt be differences in productivity growth. I completely believe the empirical literature that shows that greater immigration in the United States leads to greater productivity growth. Nonetheless, that empirical literature also shows that those effects are modest, certainly modest over a 10-year period. You know, in the tenths, not in the percentage points. On the welfare effects, I think that's adjacent to the point that I was trying to make about that these modest effects, I mean, what you might consider to be modest effects on the aggregate economy or the level of GDP, do not discount the extraordinary effects on the people who are directly affected, and the effects on me and people, you know, who share my horror of watching these. So, watching these policies be implemented. So the welfare effects on those families are, you know, like uncountably huge, and to be clear, like it's having a welfare effect on me.
Very good. Let's take some questions from the audience. I'm going to point at you and then ask for. Please wait for a mic. Say your name. Say your question. Let's start over here. Someone with a mic is going to come. Oh, there.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation today. We're with a group from California, and I'm curious if you could speak to, certainly on the one hand, the GDP of California is such that we're fourth or fifth globally and benefit largely from immigration, as was shown in the map. But at the same time, California has historically and consistently been up against some very difficult issues: poverty, homelessness, healthcare availability, including to working Americans, housing, et cetera. And certainly some of that burden is due to immigration. Can you speak to how California stands out in that regard?
I can think. I mean, I don't know that California stands out necessarily. Right, the certain relative maybe to other U.S. states for sure, but there's a number of other countries where I think the housing situation has gotten so bad, where the housing supply is so inelastic, it's so difficult to build new housing, that any population addition immediately leads to either homelessness or price increases. I would say the way to address that is to address the housing supply situation, in part because it's not just immigration from abroad, of course, that's stifled by not being able to build in a state or in a country, right? It's also immigration from other parts of the United States. It is, and that goes both ways. It's about net immigration. So it's both, you know, people people end up moving to Florida instead of to California because it's difficult to build housing in the most productive parts of California. But it's also the people who do move to California. If there's no housing construction, they displace people who were previously in California. And so I think it is a very important immigration adjacent policy area. I think the gross flows within the country are pretty large relative to the net flows from abroad, and so I don't know that just reducing immigration is going to let you address those issues. I think you do need to deal with your own housing supply situation as well.
I would just counter that the cost of housing itself is so prohibitive that even when homes are supplied, there continues to be that issue relative to...
Yeah, so I think of housing supply broadly speaking, right? So it's, you know, if it's extremely expensive to build because there are regulatory processes and I mean, you know, California has on some level access to the same home construction technologies that Tennessee and Texas have. And so, you know, under a different policy framework, you should be able to build at comparable prices.
You've not met CEQA.
No, but that's part of the policy environment, exactly. Yeah, but thank you.
I want to jump in and just say two quick things, because One is that you might think about this from the fiscal burden lens, and two, a way into, I think, answering your question also has to touch on inflation. So with the fiscal burden lens, just about any kind of immigration is good for the federal government, good for the federal government's fiscal situation, because the federal government is quite good at taxing immigrants and quite good at denying immigrants of all kinds, and particularly recent immigrants, federal benefits. This is less true at the state and local level, and that is most certainly less true at the state and local level for immigrants that require a lot of resources. And so I think the fiscal burden issue at the state and local level, particularly with the immigration surge in the last couple of years, I think it was real. And I think, so Tara Watson and I, again, to invoke Tara Watson, wrote a proposal about how the federal government should actually transfer some of the fiscal benefits to state and local communities that are more burdened by immigration flows of particular kinds. The second thing on inflation. So I did not mention inflation when I talked about the aggregate economic effects of either the surge or the decline in net migration, because it's actually quite difficult to figure out what the effect is in aggregate. It's a lot easier to think about narratives of how it will affect the price of this and affect the price of that. And one way is to think about housing. Fewer immigrants in this country mean less demand for housing, and that means lower housing prices. That's just got to be true. But immigrants also make housing. And so it's going to be a...
Not in California, though. Right?
That's right. Immigrants want to make housing in California. And so it's going to be a city by city, neighborhood by neighborhood issue as to whether or not less immigration means lower or higher housing prices in your area.
Can I just say two quick things to add on to Wendy and Stan? On the poverty, it's typically not, immigrants are low income in many cases. I mean, California is lucky you get the highest skills, immigrants obviously for the STEM industry and the high-tech industry, but yes, of course, a lot of low-skilled immigrants, but they're not the structurally poor, like they're low income, but they're working low income. They live typically in families and so forth. So they integrate and work themselves out of poverty, actually. So they're quite different from like the structurally poor population. And they also don't tend to be the homeless. So they're underrepresented among the homeless population.
No,
so
I
that's,
understand that.
okay.
I'm suggesting that, with the burdens that California already carries.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay, I see what you mean. Yeah, absolutely. I guess the only other thing is that given that net migration to California is negative, so more people leave California than come in, or, the only reason that they have growth is through international immigration. So, you need the immigrants in California if other people are leaving.
Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Let's go to the person right next to you. Yeah, please.
I was wondering if you have any data on maybe how the immigration is mapped by U.S. interference in Latin American elections.
In Latin American elections?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the biggest surge in immigration from Latin America over the last 20 years has been from Venezuela, where the U.S. has been very ineffective in interfering in its elections, I would say. We tried a couple times to get rid of Chavez. And so I would say there it's difficult to make an argument that it's U.S. interference. I think for some Central American countries you can make a better case, though, as Pia showed, that's not been, in the most recent years, that's not been the most dominant region of origin. Cuba doesn't really do elections. There's not much for us to interfere. No, I'm just thinking through the big groups. And so I don't think that's a reason driver. I think in the 1980s, maybe in the 1990s, you could make a case for some of the big origin countries back then, big Central American origin countries back then, even though those numbers were nowhere near as big as the recent flips. That's your.
I guess we've done these analysis of like push-pull factors, a horse race to see like what's the, and I don't think it fully answers your question, but pull factors are really important. So if we have rising wages and a lot of vacancies, in terms of a very tight labor market, then we tend to draw this really can explain well immigration flows, even unauthorized ones. So,
And even in the recent years, right? I think
especially in the recent years. Yeah. So although I think you're right, there still is this big question out there: is everybody moving here because we made a mess of Central America and South? There's still that question, but economists can't answer that. So.
Sorry. Yeah. Let's go over there. Sorry.
Hello, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I have a question about tariffs. I understand that the 10% that's being imposed and the threatened 90% is meant to make American businesses more competitive and more dependent on domestic labor supplies. So with the corresponding reduction in immigrant laborers, low skill and high skilled, you see a reduction in H-1B visas being granted and H-2A and H-2B visas also being reduced. How do you anticipate that the American labor workforce would be able to rise to the challenge to meet all of those conditions that are being imposed by the tariffs and the reduction in immigration?
I mean, I think the whole strategy just doesn't work. I don't think the imposition of tariffs is going to make U.S. corporations more competitive, right? If you think of them as like increasing their productivity, they will not have access to the same inputs they had. Speaking to immigration specifically, I think there's two effects. One of which you hinted at, that if you restrict access to immigrant labor, I think all else equal, that'll make U.S. companies less productive as well. In some narrow industries, maybe it'll put upward pressure on the wage of U.S. workers. In industries where currently a lot of the work is done by foreign-born workers. Of course, there's two effects even in those industries, right? One is the industry itself becomes smaller because it's less profitable to operate there. And so even in the industries where foreign labor is very heavily represented now, it's not obvious wages will go up, but it's possible. Across the board, I think the impact on wages is small but negative for native-born workers. Then on the flip side, one thing I think the tariffs will do or have done maybe a little bit already is because they've had a dampening impact on U.S. growth, they make the U.S. labor market less tight. And so it reduces the pool exercised on foreign workers. And so it'll probably reduce immigration inflows just because they undermine U.S. growth. I don't think that's the intent of the policy per se, but it works, right? In the sense that it'll reduce immigrant inflows probably. So that would be the two ways I think about it. Maybe we can do one last question, if anyone has one. Raise your hand quickly. Yes, let's go over here. Sorry.
Hi, Timothy Kasuma. I work for Third Way. So, Pia, you had a graph that showed work visas rose over the course of the last couple of years. And I'm curious if there's some sort of breakdown as to whether the people who received those jobs were people that had networks here in the US or were people that came from the newer countries like South America.
Yeah, good question. So those work permits were for the asylum seekers and the TPS, and the parole people. So those were, that was for the whole group of surge migrants. But I think we don't have a breakdown on terms of who got them by network, or did you have a migrant network or not. But I think the biggest explanatory, I think that talking to nonprofits in Chicago that were settling the Venezuelan migrants, they said that actually, waiting for the work permit was the biggest obstacle for them moving out of, the shelters into their own housing. And they said once those work permits came through, those guys found jobs too. So they didn't have networks, but they were still able to find jobs. And they did well. It was just, they were really set back because at that point, work permits were taking, more than 5 months to be processed. But yeah, they said once a work permit was in, those guys moved out in no time and found their own apartments.
And to be clear, your graph showed work permits, right? Not jobs. So you can.
Yeah.
The labor force participation rates among this recent surge have followed similar trends of labor force participation rates of previous flows of immigration. And since you invoked work permits, I want to give a shout out to the Hamilton Project at Brookings. Actually has an interactive that shows all of the work permit data as we get it. And very sadly, the last monthly number that we have, because they've slowed down on releasing these data, is in January. And in January, we actually still saw very high work permit applications, no doubt from the surge that happened through the summer of 2024, and then the trickling through the second half of 2024. But this is just to say that I think the labor market, even through April, maybe even May, was still being boosted by the immigration surge that went through the summer of 24.
Excellent. Well, let me also quickly promote something then. Next Thursday, I'm hosting an event here at this same location, different other panelists. We'll see if they do as well, on place-based visa programs, so proposals for programs where counties or localities or regions will be able to sponsor immigrants to come to the US to sort of decentralize some aspects of the immigration system a little bit. I hope to see you all there. But for now, thank you for coming and have a great rest of your day.